Imagine driving through a mountain town at night while the snow is falling so hard it erases the road behind you. A police officer follows the sound of something hitting plastic again and again inside an abandoned warehouse. When he opens the door, he does not find a person. He finds a 6-month-old German Shepherd puppy locked in a crate with no name, no food, no sound, and eyes that have already given up on the world. The officer should have called the shelter. He should have closed the door. He should have gone home. He did none of that. What happens next is a 6-chapter journey through winter, fear healing, and a miracle that nobody expected. A story about a broken dog, a tired man, and the night that changed both of them forever. Before the story begins, tell us where you're watching from right now. What country, what city, and what the weather is like outside your window. Leave it in the comments and let us walk into the snow together. Silver Hollow, Montana wore winter the way an old legend wears armor. Quiet, heavy, and unarguable. Snow fell in thick, patient sheets that night, the kind that made streetlights look like candles in a chapel and turned every sound into something distant and borrowed. The town sat cupped between dark pine ridges and a frozen river, a place where people waved with gloved hands and spoke in small sentences because the cold stole the extra words. Officer Gabriel Holt had learned to read a storm the way some men read faces. 45 years old, tall without trying to be, shoulders built by years of doors kicked in and snow shoveled out, he moved with the steady caution of someone who had already lost enough to stop rushing. His hair was dark with an early streak of gray at the temples, his jaw always a little too tight, as if he'd once bitten down on grief and never let his teeth unclench. Folks in town said Holt was polite but not soft, kind in the way a mountain is kind. It won't flatter you, but it won't lie either. Before Silver Hollow, he'd worn a bigger badge in a bigger place. Then, a winter crash on an icy highway took his partner and his appetite for noise. After that, he chose a town with more elk than sirens, and a cabin set back from the road where the trees could keep his secrets. Tonight, he was finishing paperwork in the small station, coffee gone lukewarm, radio humming low, when the dispatcher's voice cut through like a knife through cloth. Marlene Bishop was 62, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, and shaped by a lifetime of keeping chaos in neat boxes. She wore thick reading glasses that always sat slightly crooked, as if even her face refused to be perfectly orderly, and she spoke with the calm of a woman who had listened to storms for decades and never once let them hear her panic. "Holt," she said, "we've got a call from Old Mill Road, report of banging, metal on metal, coming from the abandoned cold storage warehouse." She paused, then softened the way Marlene rarely did. The caller's Sarah Lyle. Holt knew the name. Sarah was a widowed school bus driver in her late 50s, short and sturdy, cheeks reddened by wind and worry, the kind of woman who offered casseroles at funerals and still cried in private years later. Since her husband's death, she'd become the town's unofficial guardian of stray things: lost gloves, runaway kids, wounded birds. The loss had made her braver in one way and more jumpy in another. She heard danger everywhere because she'd once learned how quietly it arrived. "She says it's not the wind," Marlene added. "She says it sounds like something trying to get out." Holt didn't waste time pretending the road would be kind. He pulled on his heavy coat, clipped his flashlight to his chest, and stepped into the night. The cold hit him like a slap from an invisible hand. Snow swarmed his patrol truck as he drove, the wipers pushing white ghosts aside, the headlights carving a tunnel through the falling dark. Old Mill Road ran along the river's edge, past rusted fences and boarded windows, past the skeleton of a town that used to be louder when logging money still flowed. The warehouse squatted at the end like a forgotten beast, flat roof sagging, corrugated walls tattooed by years of weather. One broken sign still clinging to the front. Silver Hollow Cold Storage, letters missing like teeth. Sarah's car sat crooked near the gate, hazard lights blinking through the snow. She stood beside it, bundled in a puffy coat with a knitted hat pulled low, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles looked pale even in the amber wash of the lights. When Holt stepped out, she hurried forward, boots crunching, breath steaming. "Officer Holt," she said, voice trembling but determined. "Thank God. I didn't want to call, I didn't want to be dramatic, but..." "Listen." Holt listened. At first, there was only snow and distance, the hush of flakes landing, the faint groan of wind. Then it came again. 3 dull thuds, like a fist striking plastic, followed by a thin scrape, like something dragging itself across a hard floor. Sarah's eyes darted to the dark doorway. "It's been doing that on and off," she whispered, "like it's running out of strength." Holt nodded once, the way men do when they're trying not to let fear borrow their voice. "You did right calling," he said. His tone wasn't comforting like a blanket. It was steady, like a railing. "Stay by the car, doors locked. If you hear me shout, you drive." She swallowed hard and obeyed. Inside the warehouse, the air changed. The cold had a different taste. Older, metallic, threaded with the sour tang of rot and forgotten chemicals. Holt's flashlight beams swept across dust-coated pallets and broken crates, across a floor glazed with ice in patches where the roof had once leaked. Snow had drifted in through a jagged hole in the wall, making pale dunes inside, as if winter itself had claimed the place. The sound came again, nearer this time. Holt followed it past a row of toppled shelves, boots careful on the slick concrete. His light caught something that didn't belong, a plastic dog crate, half buried in a mound of snow and debris, strapped to a rusted dolly. Around it, a length of chain had been looped and padlocked through the crate's handle and the dolly frame, as if whoever left it here didn't want it to be moved. Not by wind, not by kindness, not by fate. The crate was the color of old bones, scratched and stained, with a few tufts of dark fur caught in the vents. Holt crouched, heart tightening in that familiar way it did when his mind tried to prepare his body for the worst. "Hey," he said softly, not to the crate, but to whatever might still be alive inside it. "It's okay. I'm here." The next sound was smaller, more like a tremor than a bang. Holt angled the light through the grated door. At first, he saw only darkness and a pair of eyes that didn't reflect like healthy eyes should. They looked matte, dulled, as if the world had turned off their shine. Then the beam slid lower and revealed a shape pressed into the far corner. A German Shepherd puppy, maybe 6 months old, black and tan coat made patchy by dirt and shedding stress, ears not fully upright yet, one tipped slightly as if it had forgotten how to listen. He was too thin, not the sleek athletic thin of a growing working dog, but the sharp thin of hunger and prolonged fear. His ribs wrote themselves under his fur. His paws were big, the clumsy promise of the dog he was meant to become, but his body was folded tight like a question mark, as if he was trying to erase his own existence. A tag hung from his collar, no name, no address, just a bent strip of metal that clicked faintly when he breathed. Holt felt anger flare, clean and hot. Then he buried it, because anger was loud and this creature looked like it might shatter from loud. He tested the chain. It was tight. The padlock was cheap but stubborn. Holt stood, moved back a step and called out, "Marlene, it's Holt." His radio crackled, her voice steady. "I'm here. I've got a dog, puppy, locked in a crate, chained to a dolly. I'm going to cut the lock." "Copy," she said. Then, softer, "You good?" Holt exhaled. "Not yet." He pulled a small bolt cutter from his trunk, a tool he'd used on fences and cuffs and the occasional frozen gate. The metal jaws bit down on the padlock with a sharp crunch. The sound echoed through the warehouse like a gunshot. The puppy flinched, not outward, not a bark or a lunge, but inward, as if his bones tried to crawl away from his skin. Holt froze, then lowered his own breathing, making himself smaller in the space. "I'm sorry," he murmured. "Just getting you out." The lock fell away. Holt unlooped the chain carefully, letting it clink softly to the floor. He placed a hand on the crate's top, not pressing, just resting, like you might rest a palm against a door before knocking. "Hey, kid," he said, voice rough around the edges. "You're not alone anymore." The puppy didn't respond. No growl, no whine, only the slow rise and fall of a chest that seemed unsure it deserved oxygen. Holt opened the crate door an inch and paused, giving space, giving choice. The puppy stayed pinned in the back corner, eyes fixed not on Holt but past him, past the light, past the world, as if his mind was somewhere else entirely. Holt could have reached in. He'd wrestled drunk men twice his size. He'd carried bleeding strangers out of wrecks. But this wasn't that kind of rescue. This wasn't a battle. This was a fragile negotiation with a soul that had learned stillness was survival. Holt backed away and turned his body sideways, gaze angled to the floor. He slid his gloves off and tossed them aside so his hands looked softer, less like tools. He spoke quietly about nothing. About the snow, about the old building, about how the storm would pass by morning. He wasn't sure the puppy heard words, but sometimes tone was a rope you threw into a dark well and prayed something would grab on. After a long minute, Holt eased forward again, arms slow, and slid one hand under the puppy's chest, the other supporting his back legs. The body was rigid at first, trembling like a branch in wind. Then the puppy didn't fight. He simply surrendered. Not trust. Trust was too big a word for eyes like these. It was more like he had run out of options and chosen the least terrible one. Holt lifted him against his coat. The puppy was lighter than he should have been. Holt felt the tiny hammering of a heartbeat through the thin fur, frantic and faint, and something in his own chest answered it. A memory of holding his partner's hand in the snow years ago. The helplessness. The prayer you don't say out loud because you're afraid it won't be heard. He carried the puppy outside into the storm. Sarah gasped, hand flying to her mouth. "Oh my God," she breathed, tears forming instantly, freezing at the lashes. "He's just a baby," Holt nodded, jaw set. "Yeah," he said, "and someone wanted him to disappear." Sarah stepped closer, then stopped herself, like she didn't want her compassion to startle him. "Is he hurt?" Holt examined quickly. No obvious blood, no visible fractures, just exhaustion and cold, and that eerie quiet that meant the injury might be deeper than skin. "Not bleeding," Holt said, "but he's shut down." He didn't say the rest. That shutdown could be more dangerous than panic, because at least panic meant a will to survive. Holt opened the back door of his truck and laid a blanket on the seat. He set the puppy down gently but kept one hand on him a moment longer than necessary, feeling the tremble, promising without words. "I'm taking him home," Holt said. Sarah blinked. "Home? Not the shelter?" Holt looked back at the warehouse, then at the falling snow, then at the puppy's eyes. Those eyes that had learned to go far away. "Not tonight," he said. "That place is loud. He needs quiet." Sarah nodded, swallowing. "If you need anything, food, blankets, I've got—" "I know," Holt interrupted gently. "Thank you, Sarah. You did the right thing." As Holt slid into the driver's seat, the puppy curled tighter on the blanket, as if trying to fold himself back into invisibility. The storm pressed against the windows. The road ahead disappeared into white. Holt started the engine and drove toward his cabin, one hand steady on the wheel, the other hovering near the back seat like a silent vow. In the rearview mirror, he caught a glimpse of the puppy's face, Atlas, though Holt didn't know the name yet, watching nothing, believing nothing, surviving anyway. And Holt realized, with the cold clarity of someone stepping into deep water, that this rescue wasn't a single moment in a warehouse. It was the beginning of a long, slow war against an old fear. The snow kept falling, soft as mercy, relentless as time, and Silver Hollow held its breath as if the mountain itself wanted to see whether a man who had lost so much could still teach a broken puppy how to come back. The road from the abandoned warehouse to Gabriel Holt's cabin wound through a forest that looked like it had been carved out of moonlight and frost. Snow swallowed the tire tracks almost as soon as the truck passed, as if the mountain itself were erasing the evidence of everything that had just happened. Holt drove slowly, one hand steady on the wheel, the other resting against the back of the seat, close enough that he could feel the faint tremor running through the body curled on the blanket behind him. Atlas did not move. He lay folded in on himself like a sentence that refused to be finished. His breathing was so shallow, Holt had to check the rearview mirror twice to make sure his chest was still rising. Holt's cabin sat at the edge of the tree line, a low structure of dark timber and smoke-stained stone, its windows glowing amber against the storm. The place had once belonged to his father, a man who believed in quiet mornings and fixed things instead of feelings. After the crash that took Holt's partner and most of his old life with him, the cabin became a refuge. No neighbors close enough to hear the radio. No traffic. Just snow, pine, and the river speaking in its sleep. He killed the engine and the sudden silence pressed in around them. When Holt opened the back door, the cold lunged for his lungs. He leaned in and slid one arm beneath Atlas's chest and the other beneath his back legs. The puppy's body went rigid for half a second, then sagged as if the idea of resisting had finally used up its last strength. Inside, the cabin smelled of cedarwood and old coffee, and the faint metal tang of winter coats hung too long by the door. Holt carried Atlas to the living room and laid him gently on a folded quilt near the fireplace. The puppy did not uncurl. He did not look around. His eyes remained fixed on nothing. Holt knelt there for a long moment, unsure what came next. Then another presence filled the room. Briggs patted in first. Briggs was an 8-year-old Belgian Malinois, retired from police work after a torn ligament and too many winters. His coat was a weathered tan, his muzzle graying, his eyes still sharp but no longer hard. He moved with the careful dignity of an old soldier who had learned when not to waste his steps. Behind him came Luna. Luna was a 3-year-old Labrador mix with soft golden fur and a face permanently shaped into concern. She had been pulled from a flood zone in Wyoming as a pup and had never entirely forgotten the sound of water. Where Briggs was all angles and watchfulness, Luna was curves and gravity. She believed deeply in closeness. Both dogs stopped several feet from the quilt. Briggs lowered his head, reading the room. Luna sat and tilted her head, ears folding forward as if listening to something only she could hear. Atlas did nothing. Holt watched the three of them, breath caught somewhere between his ribs and his throat. "Easy," he murmured, not sure who the word was for. Briggs stepped closer, slow, nose working. He circled the quilt once, careful not to touch, then lay down with his back to the door, eyes on Holt, a silent message of perimeter secure. Luna crept forward on her belly and settled beside Atlas, close enough that her warmth brushed his flank. She did not lick. She did not whine. She simply lay there, breathing, as if to say, "This is how we stay." Holt let out a breath he did not remember holding. He moved around the cabin gathering supplies like a man building a small island in a rising sea. Water bowl, kibble, a can of chicken he kept for storms. He placed everything within reach of the quilt, but not too close, leaving Atlas a wide space of decision. Then he sat down on the floor, back against the couch, hands open on his knees, and waited. Time did not move normally that night. Outside, the wind raked the trees, and the snow piled itself into the corners of the world. Inside, nothing happened at all. Atlas did not eat. He did not drink. He did not even lift his head. Only his breathing proved he was still in the room. Every now and then, a gust of wind shoved against the cabin, or a branch snapped under the weight of snow. And Holt would see Atlas's body lock even tighter, as if the sound had reached in and pulled a string. Holt stayed where he was. Around midnight, the fire burned low. Holt rose, fed it more wood, and returned to the floor. He thought about his partner, about the night of the crash on Highway 2 when the truck came out of the dark too fast and everything after that became slow and broken. He remembered sitting on the shoulder of the road with snow drifting onto his uniform, listening to sirens that arrived too late and thinking, "This is what it feels like when the world refuses to breathe with you." He glanced at Atlas. The puppy's eyes were still wide open, still somewhere far away. "Hey," Holt said quietly, "you don't have to go there anymore." The words were not magic. They were not even convincing, but they were true. And sometimes truth was all you had. Near dawn, Atlas's nose twitched once. Just once. Luna noticed immediately. Her tail made the smallest tap against the floor. Holt did not move. The twitch did not come again. Morning crept into the cabin on pale blue light. The storm had passed, leaving the world blank and innocent. Frost stitched silver lines across the windows. Holt shifted carefully, muscles aching from the floor, and poured a handful of chicken into Atlas's bowl. The smell filled the room. Nothing. He slid the bowl a few inches closer and sat down again. Hours passed like that. Bowl closer, chair closer. Holt talking quietly about the weather, about the river, about the way the mountains looked when spring finally showed up. Atlas did not answer. By late afternoon, Holt was afraid. Not the loud fear of blood and sirens, the quiet fear of losing someone who was still breathing. The sound that finally broke the day was not the wind. It was the snowplow. The engine's low growl rolled through the trees, followed by the metallic crash of chains hitting the pavement. The noise wrapped itself around the cabin and squeezed. Atlas collapsed. One moment he was lying on the quilt. The next, his legs folded beneath him and his body flattened against the floor, every muscle locked, eyes draining of whatever light they had found overnight. Holt was on his knees before he realized he had moved. "It's okay," he said, but Atlas could not hear him. Briggs rose and stood over the puppy, head low, body a barrier. Luna pressed against Atlas's back, her breathing slow and deliberate. The plow passed. The sound faded. Atlas did not return. Holt lay down on the floor beside the quilt, not touching, just close enough that their shoulders nearly met. He breathed in, then out, exaggerating the motion, giving Atlas something steady to lean against if he could still feel anything at all. Minutes ticked by. Then Atlas's ears twitched. Then his eyes blinked once. When he finally drew a deeper breath, Holt's hands began to shake. Night fell again. By the third day, Holt was counting victories in millimeters. Atlas drank half the water in the bowl while Holt's back was turned. On the fourth day, Atlas swallowed one piece of chicken. On the fifth, Holt moved his chair close enough that he could feel Atlas's heat. On the sixth night, Atlas's eyes followed Holt when he crossed the room. The breakthrough came without ceremony. Holt placed a single piece of chicken on the floor about 18 inches from Atlas's paws and turned his head away. The room was silent. Then the faintest scrape of claws. Holt did not look. Another scrape. A pause. When he finally allowed himself to glance over, the chicken was gone. Atlas had not moved his body, but his eyes were no longer on the wall. They were on Holt. Something like hope slipped through Holt's ribs and lodged in his chest. He did not smile. He did not speak. He simply stayed. That night, as the cabin settled and the world went quiet, Holt sat on the edge of the couch, facing away from Atlas. Luna slept near his feet. Briggs kept watch at the door. He felt it before he saw it, the lightest touch of a cold nose against his elbow. Gone. Atlas had chosen. Holt closed his eyes and let the fear in. Because now there was something he could lose. The mountains around Silver Hollow woke beneath a sky the color of old steel. Wind dragged its claws across the snowfields, lifting thin white veils that slid like ghosts between the trees. Inside Holt's cabin, the fire had burned down to embers, leaving the air sharp and cold, as if the night itself refused to let go. Atlas lay on the quilt where he had learned how to exist. Not how to live, just how to remain in the room. He had eaten twice in 2 days, a few bites of chicken, a mouthful of water. Each small act had felt like watching the sun rise after a year of darkness. But the German Shepherd puppy was still trapped behind his eyes, still listening for something that did not belong to this place. Officer Gabriel Holt watched him from the table where his coffee had gone, untouched. The lines in Holt's face were deeper now, cut by sleepless nights and the kind of worry that settles into bone. He had always carried himself like a man built from the weather, but lately even the mountain seemed unsure of him. Briggs lay near the door, ears flicking at every distant sound. Old soldier, old wounds. He knew when something inside the house was fighting a battle it could not win alone. Luna remained beside Atlas, her body curved into his like a second heartbeat. They had developed a rhythm. Holt would rise before dawn, break the frost off the windows, brew coffee he never finished, and then sit on the floor, back against the couch, counting breaths. Atlas would lie still, eyes half open, watching the wall. Sometimes Holt would read out loud, not because he thought Atlas cared about words, but because the sound of a voice kept the ghosts from growing too loud. The first sound came just after noon. a low mechanical growl rolling up the valley. Holt froze. Briggs was on his feet immediately, head turning toward the windows. Luna lifted her head, ears sliding back. Atlas's body locked. The snowplow's engine climbed the road, chains slapping metal, the sound slicing straight through the cabin walls. Holt had seen plenty of dogs flinch. He had seen panic, flight, teeth. What happened to Atlas was something else entirely. One second the puppy was lying on the quilt. The next, his legs folded beneath him and his body flattened against the floor, as if gravity had suddenly doubled. His eyes went empty. Not wide, not afraid. Gone. It was as if someone had reached into him and switched the lights off. Holt dropped to his knees beside him. Atlas. The name did not exist yet, but the urgency did. Briggs stepped closer, his frame between Atlas and the door. Luna pressed against Atlas's side, nose nudging his shoulder. Nothing. The plow passed. The sound faded. The valley exhaled. Atlas did not come back. Holt lay down on the floor, his shoulder almost touching the quilt, his breath deliberately slow and heavy. He remembered another night, years ago, when he had been trapped inside a flipped cruiser on the side of Highway 2, glass in his hair, snow in his mouth, the world roaring too loud. He had survived that night because someone had stayed and spoken to him until the dark loosened its grip. So Holt stayed. After a long time, Atlas's ears twitched. Then one eye blinked. When his chest finally pulled in a deeper breath, Holt felt his own lungs burn with relief. The next day brought no mercy. A logging truck downshifted on the far road. The clatter of its load echoed off the cliffs. Atlas collapsed again. Each episode stripped something from Holt he had not known was finite. He started keeping a notebook. Sounds, times, reactions. Trying to map the storm inside a mind that had learned too early that loud meant pain. By the end of the week, Holt realized the truth. Atlas was not afraid of noise. He was living inside it. The cabin became a hospital of inches. Holt moved the food bowl closer by fractions of space. He placed himself on the floor instead of the chair. He let Atlas see him breathe. Days blurred. Snow piled against the windows. The river froze into blue stone. One night, when the wind rattled the shutters and the fire popped too loudly, Atlas's body went rigid again, but this time, something was different. His eyes stayed. They did not disappear. Holt whispered, "That's it. Stay." Atlas trembled so hard Holt could feel it through the floorboards. Then, slowly, the tremor softened. Progress did not look like victory. It looked like survival with the volume turned down. The breakthrough came at dusk. Holt had placed 2 pieces of chicken on the floor, one close to Atlas's paws, one halfway between the quilt and Holt's knee. He turned his face toward the wall, making himself small. The cabin was silent. Then a scrape. Holt did not move. Another scrape. When he finally allowed himself to glance over, the first piece of chicken was gone. Atlas's body had not shifted, but his eyes were on Holt. Not past him. On him. Holt felt something crack inside his chest. He did not reach. He did not speak. He simply stayed. That night, Holt made a decision. Atlas would not go back into a crate. The next morning, Holt moved the quilt closer to the fire and set an old mattress on the floor beside it. No walls, no echo, no cage. Atlas watched him. Later, Holt tried something he had been avoiding. He clipped a lightweight harness around Atlas's chest. The puppy folded in half, not struggling, not resisting, disappearing. Holt knelt beside him on the floor, his hands still on the straps, his voice low and steady. I know. It took almost an hour to reach the back door. When they did, Atlas saw the world beyond the glass and collapsed again, legs refusing to hold him. Holt did not pull. He sat down on the cold wood floor and waited. Briggs paced once. Luna lay down beside Atlas. Eventually, Atlas stood. They made it to the porch. The mountain breathed around them. Atlas took one step into the snow, then another. The world did not end. Holt swallowed hard. They had not walked. They had not gone anywhere, but the door was open now, and something inside Atlas had shifted. That night, Holt lay awake listening to the wind in the trees and the soft breathing of 3 dogs in his cabin. He understood something he had not wanted to admit. He was no longer just trying to save a dog. He was learning how to walk back into his own life alongside one. Morning in Silver Hollow arrived without asking permission. The sky remained the color of pewter, the sun only a rumor behind thick winter clouds, and the forest stood motionless as if it were listening for something it had not yet been told. Snow had fallen through the night and sealed the valley in white. Even the river seemed to hesitate, its frozen surface marked by long blue veins that looked like the bones of the mountain showing through. Atlas stood on the threshold of the cabin. Not inside. Not outside. He hovered at the edge of both worlds, his front paws trembling just inside the open door, the cold breath of winter rolling in around his nose like an invitation and a threat. His ears were half-pinned, his eyes wide and shining with that fragile kind of attention that belonged to creatures who had learned that the world could vanish at any moment. Officer Gabriel Holt sat on the floor behind him, boots off, coat open, his hands resting on his knees where Atlas could see they were empty. Holt's face looked older in the winter light, the lines carved deeper by weeks of sleepless nights, and the kind of hope that refused to move quickly. He had not rushed this moment. He had woken before dawn and lit the fire, brewed coffee he had not touched, opened the door, and then waited. Atlas inhaled. The air outside smelled like snow and pine sap and distance. It smelled like the long road back to life. Luna lay stretched behind him, her chin on the floor, eyes soft. Briggs stood near the wall, silent as a statue carved from patience. Holt did not speak. After a long time, Atlas lifted one paw and placed it into the snow. The sound was almost nothing. A whisper. Holt's breath hitched anyway. Atlas stared at his paw as if it had betrayed him. The snow did not bite. The ground did not disappear. The sky did not fall. He placed the other paw down. For a heartbeat, the world held still. Then Atlas took his first step. The puppy's paw pressed into the untouched snow and left behind a small, imperfect print. Not deep, not confident, but real. Holt's vision blurred. He did not wipe his eyes. He did not want to interrupt the moment with anything that belonged to before. Atlas stood there, trembling, his chest moving fast as if waiting for punishment that did not arrive. When none came, he took another step, and then another. They did not go far. Just the edge of the porch. Just enough. The door remained open behind them, warmth waiting like a promise. That afternoon, Holt clipped the harness around Atlas's chest again. The puppy froze, his body sagging under the weight of memory. But this time his eyes did not leave Holt's face. That alone felt like a small miracle. They reached the end of the porch. The snowfield beyond the cabin stretched wide and bright and terrifying. Holt pushed the door open fully. Atlas collapsed. His legs slid out from beneath him, his body flattening against the wood, as if he were trying to melt into the planks and disappear from the sky. Holt did not pull. He lowered himself onto the porch beside him and waited, the leash loose, his presence steady. Luna curled against Atlas's back. Briggs remained at the threshold. Blocking the world with his body, the wind whispered through the trees. After a long while, Atlas lifted his head. They made it to the yard. The next day, Holt tried something bigger. The road that curved past the cabin was narrow and quiet, used mostly by delivery trucks and the occasional logging rig. Holt knew every bend. He knew the way the mountain trapped sound and sent it back twice as loud. They stepped onto the snow-covered shoulder. Atlas moved like a creature made of glass. Each step took effort. His ears flicked at every distant crack of ice, every snap of wind through frozen branches. Then the truck came. It did not appear suddenly. It announced itself from far away, a deep, rising growl that rolled through the valley and wrapped around Atlas's bones. Atlas collapsed. He folded onto the snow as if the ground had reached up and taken him. His eyes went empty. His chest barely moved. The logging truck passed slowly, chains clattering, metal ringing against metal. Holt dropped to his knees in the snow beside him. Cars moved past. People stared. One man slowed, window rolling down as if to ask if Holt needed help. Holt shook his head once. He chose Atlas over his pride. He stayed. It took nearly 15 minutes for Atlas's ears to twitch. Another 10 for his eyes to return. When Atlas finally lifted his head, Holt felt something break loose in his chest. They did not turn back. They finished the block. That night, Holt lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind scratch the cabin walls, and thought about how long it had been since he had chosen anything that required this much courage. The next morning, the sky was a soft gray. The snow had stopped. They walked again. This time, they reached the frozen creek at the edge of the property. Atlas lowered his head and sniffed the ice, uncertain, curious. 3 steps onto the white crust. That was all, but it was everything. When they returned to the cabin, Holt removed the harness and Atlas did not flee. He followed Holt into the kitchen. The door was open now. That afternoon, Holt sat on the porch with a notebook and watched Atlas move across the yard, leaving a scatter of paw prints that crisscrossed the snow like a map to something new. Briggs dozed in the sun. Luna chased falling flakes. And for the first time since the night in the warehouse, Holt allowed himself to imagine a future that did not feel like something he had to survive. Winter returned the way it always did in Silver Hollow, without asking, without mercy. The sky dropped low over the ridges, heavy as an unspoken warning. The radio at the station crackled all morning with weather updates and lost time reports. The kind of day when the mountains decided who would be allowed to come home. Officer Gabriel Holt had just finished a slow walk with Atlas when the call came in. Hiker missing. Northern Ridge. Storm rolling fast. Holt felt it in his bones before he heard it in Marlene's voice. Wind's coming up hard, she said. Search teams mobilizing, but visibility's already dropping. Holt looked down at Atlas. The puppy stood beside him now, not behind him. His tail hung low but steady. His ears were half raised, catching the world. Snow had gathered along his muzzle and lashes, making him look like something born of the storm itself. You stay, Holt said quietly, reaching for the truck keys. Atlas did not move. Holt hesitated. The old part of him, the part shaped by manuals and protocols, told him this was not a job for a dog who had once collapsed at the sound of wind. The newer part of him, the one that had learned to count miracles in inches, said something else entirely. Briggs and Luna sensed the shift immediately. Briggs rose, alert. Luna's tail stilled. Holt opened the back of the truck. The crate sat there, not closed, not locked, more like a cave than a cage now. Atlas stepped toward it, paused, and looked up at Holt. That look carried no fear, only a question. Yes, Holt said. You're coming. They drove into the storm. By the time they reached the ridge trailhead, the world had narrowed to white and wind, snow knifed sideways, pines bent and groaned. The search team had already fanned out, their headlamps slicing useless tunnels through the chaos. The missing hiker was a man in his 60s named Thomas Reddick, a retired surveyor who had lived in Silver Hollow since the mills closed. He was stubborn, proud, and deeply allergic to asking for help. He had gone out that morning to check an old boundary marker and never come back. Holt clipped the long lead to Atlas's harness. Find, he whispered. Atlas lifted his nose. The scent was thin. Old. Broken by wind and falling snow. The storm tried to erase it the way it erased everything. Atlas hesitated. The mountain roared. A distant crash echoed from somewhere up the slope. Wind knocking loose old snowpack, or something heavier shifting its bones. Atlas flinched. Holt knelt in the snow beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. Breathe, Holt said, not knowing whether the word was for Atlas or for himself. Atlas's chest shuddered. Then the puppy took one step forward. Another. The wind screamed. The sound wrapped around Atlas's body, and for a heartbeat, Holt thought the old storm inside him would rise and swallow him whole. But Atlas did not fold. He pushed into the wind. The searchline moved. Minutes stretched into hours, measured only by numb fingers and the ache of hope. The storm swallowed voices. Radios died. The world reduced itself to the sound of breathing and the sight of Atlas's dark shape cutting forward through the white. Then Atlas stopped. His body went still. Holt's heart slammed. Atlas lifted his head. His ears turned. His nose cut sharply left. He pulled. Holt followed. They climbed into a narrow gully where the wind howled less violently. There, beneath a twisted fir and half buried by snow, lay Thomas Reddick, alive, barely. His leg was pinned under a fallen branch. His jacket had frozen into the shape of the mountain. His breath came in shallow ghosts. Holt dropped beside him, hands moving fast, calm forced over terror. "Tom," he said. "It's Holt. We got you." Thomas's eyes fluttered. Atlas pressed against Thomas's chest. The old man's hand twitched and closed weakly in Atlas's fur. That was when the mountain shifted. The wind screamed again. Snow roared from the upper ridge. The gully filled with white. Holt threw his body over Thomas and Atlas as the world collapsed. For long seconds there was nothing but noise and cold and weight. When the mountain finally stilled, the world had changed shape. The radio was gone. The trail was gone. The storm sealed them inside its fist. Dark fell early. Holt worked with frozen hands, freeing Thomas's leg, wrapping him in thermal blanket, packing snow for insulation. Atlas lay pressed along Thomas's ribs, his body a furnace of life. The temperature dropped. Holt began to feel the edge of sleep creeping in, the dangerous, gentle kind. Atlas lifted his head and pressed his nose hard against Holt's face. Again and again. "Good boy," Holt whispered. "Stay with me." They stayed like that through the night, a man, an old hiker, and the once-broken puppy holding the dark back with breath and fur. When dawn finally cracked the sky, the storm had passed. The rescue team found them by following Atlas's tracks. Atlas did not move when they arrived. He stayed pressed against Thomas until the medics took over. When they finally lifted Thomas onto the sled, Atlas watched them, then turned and walked back to Holt. Holt sank into the snow and pulled Atlas into his chest. "You saved him," Holt said. Atlas's tail moved once. The mountain had taken him. And Atlas had come back. Spring did not arrive in Silver Hollow all at once. It crept in the way healing always does. Slowly, uncertainly, leaving winter behind in thin, forgotten corners. The storm that had nearly taken them all finally retreated into memory. The mountain stood quiet again, its ridges no longer roaring but breathing, long and steady. The river loosened its grip on the ice. Snow melted from the cabin roof in silver threads that tapped against the porch like soft applause. Atlas watched it all from the doorway. He was no longer the dog who folded himself into absence. His coat had filled in, thick and luminous under the new sun. His ribs were no longer visible. His ears stood tall now, alert and curious, as if the world had finally given him something worth listening for. Officer Gabriel Holt stood beside him, one hand resting lightly on Atlas's shoulder, the other holding a mug of coffee he would forget to drink. The scars of winter still lived in Holt's face. The deeper lines, the quiet heaviness behind his eyes. But something new had joined them. A steadiness, the kind that comes from surviving something together. The town had already begun to whisper about the dog. They said the once broken German shepherd had pulled a man out of the mountain. They said the storm would have taken Thomas Reddick if not for that dog and the man who refused to leave him. They said some dogs are born with more courage than they should be allowed to carry. Holt said nothing. He simply kept walking the ridge each morning with Atlas at his side. Training began in earnest as the snow receded. Search and rescue teams from the county came to the cabin. Men and women with wind-cracked faces, heavy boots, and voices that carried the mountains inside them. They tested Atlas carefully. No rush, no noise he couldn't choose to meet. They watched how he tracked, how he stayed close, how he returned when called. Atlas failed some days. On others, he surprised them all. The engines still frightened him. The clatter of metal still made his muscles tighten. But now, after the sound passed, he came back. He no longer vanished into himself. Holt noticed the change the most in the evenings. Atlas no longer slept with one eye open. He stretched out on the rug between the front door and the hallway, his body positioned where he could see both entrances, but his breathing slow, deep, peaceful. Briggs slept nearby, his old bones finally content. Luna curled against Atlas's back, her tail brushing his flank in dreams. Some nights Holt woke to find Atlas watching him, not in fear, in recognition. One evening, Holt took Atlas to the ridge where the storm had nearly ended everything. Snow still clung to the shadows of the pines. The wind was gentle now, carrying the scent of thawing earth and distant water. Holt knelt and brushed his gloved hand through Atlas's fur. "You never had a name," he said quietly. "Not one that stayed." Atlas's ears turned toward him. Holt smiled faintly. "You pulled a man out of the mountain. You walked back from the dark. You chose this world when you had every reason not to." He hesitated, then said the word he had been carrying for weeks. "Atlas." The puppy lifted his head, not at the sound, at the meaning. Holt repeated it. "Atlas." The dog stood. His tail moved, not wild, not afraid, just certain. He stepped forward. Holt's breath caught. "Atlas." The dog came to him, not because he had been called, but because he knew who he was. By early summer, Atlas was officially registered as a search and rescue dog. The paperwork said what the mountain already knew. Holt continued working his usual shifts, but something about the job felt different now. He no longer carried his partner's memory alone. Atlas walked beside him through the station, through the town, through the days that had once been too quiet. Children at the school waited by the fence to see the big shepherd pass. Old men at the diner nodded with approval. Sarah Lyle cried openly the first time Atlas licked her hand. Thomas Reddick came by the cabin one afternoon, walking slowly with a cane, eyes bright with life that had almost been taken. He knelt in the snow and pressed his forehead against Atlas's. "You kept me here," he whispered. Atlas wagged once. Winter tried to return in late October. The wind howled. Snow dusted the peaks again. The mountain reminded them all it still existed. That night, Holt woke to the sound of the storm. For a moment, the old fear rose in him. Then he felt the weight against his side. Atlas lay beside the bed, breathing slow, solid, real. Holt reached down and touched his fur. The storm did not win. Months passed. The world turned green, then gold, then white again. On the first true snowfall of the new winter, Holt and Atlas stood outside the cabin, watching the flakes descend in silence. Holt spoke without turning. "You're home." Atlas pressed his shoulder against Holt's leg. The snow fell thicker, softer, as if the mountain itself had learned how to listen. Sometimes God does not send miracles with thunder and light. Sometimes he sends them with snow and patience, with a tired man who refuses to walk away, with a broken dog who learns how to breathe again. This story is not only about a German shepherd and a police officer. It is about all of us, because in everyday life we all carry something heavy: fear, grief, disappointment, loneliness, or loss. And we all stand at moments where it would be easier to close the door. But the greatest changes happen when we choose to stay. If God can bring life back into a heart that had almost given up in the middle of a winter storm, then he can bring hope into any life. Watching this today, wherever you are right now, whatever you are carrying, may God wrap you in his peace. May he strengthen your heart. May he guide your steps forward. If this story touched you, please share it with someone who needs hope. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Subscribe to the channel so more stories of healing can reach more hearts. And if you believe in the power of prayer, write Amen in the comments. And may God bless every soul reading this tonight.